Princess Vela stood in the center of the grand hall, her hands shaking beneath the long sleeves of her ceremonial robe. The fabric was made from the finest silk her planet could produce, dyed in the traditional purple color of Corthan royalty. But no amount of beautiful clothing could calm the fear that twisted in her chest. Today was the day she would marry a human, and the thought terrified her more than anything she had ever faced. She had known about this arrangement for 3 months. 3 long months of sleepless nights and worried days. The Galactic Council had decided that peace between the Corthan Empire and the human territories required more than just signed papers and promises. They wanted a bond, a marriage that would tie the two species together in a way that could not be easily broken. And Vela, as the youngest princess of the royal family, had been chosen for this duty. The humans were frightening creatures. Everyone in the Empire knew the stories. They came from a small blue planet on the edge of explored space, a world that nobody had paid much attention to until recently. But these humans had proven themselves to be warriors unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. They fought with a fury that seemed to have no limits. When their enemies thought they were beaten, the humans would rise again, more determined than before. They never surrendered, never stopped, never showed mercy when they believed their cause was just. Vela had watched the footage from the border conflicts. She had seen human soldiers charging forward even when their bodies were wounded, even when logic said they should retreat. The military analysts called it recklessness. Others called it courage. But to Vela it looked like madness. And now she was supposed to bind her life to one of these unpredictable beings. The doors at the far end of the hall opened with a deep sound that echoed off the stone walls. Vela's breath caught in her throat. Through the doorway walked the human delegation, and at the front of the group was him, Commander Jake Morrison of the Terran Defense Fleet, the man who would become her husband in less than an hour. He was tall, much taller than any Corthan male. His shoulders were broad and his body moved with the confident ease of a trained fighter. His hair was dark, cut short in the military style of his people. His uniform was crisp and formal, decorated with medals and ribbons that spoke of battles fought and won. But it was his eyes that held Vela's attention. They were a deep brown color, and as they looked around the hall, they seemed to take in every detail, measuring and assessing everything they saw. When those eyes finally found her, Vela felt a chill run down her spine. She told herself it was just the temperature in the hall. She told herself it meant nothing. But deep down she knew it was fear. Jake Morrison crossed the hall with steady steps, his boots clicking against the polished floor. When he reached the raised platform where Vela stood with her family and the council representatives, he stopped and gave a formal bow. It was the correct gesture according to Corthan custom, perfectly executed. Someone had trained him well. "Princess Vela," he said, and his voice was deeper than she expected. "It is an honor to meet you." Vela managed a small nod. "Commander Morrison." The ceremony began immediately. There was no time for conversation, no chance to delay what was coming. The council representative, a tall being from the ancient Valaxian species, spoke the traditional words in the common galactic language. Marriage in the council's eyes was not about love or personal choice. It was a contract, a legal binding that served political purposes. Two individuals agreeing to represent an alliance between their peoples. Vela spoke her required lines in a voice that sounded hollow to her own ears. She promised to honor the agreement, to serve as a bridge between her people and humanity, to uphold the treaty with her actions and her loyalty. Jake spoke his own promises, his pronunciation of the Corthan phrases surprisingly good. He must have practiced for hours to get the clicking consonants right. When the moment came to seal the bond, Jake stepped forward and offered his hand. It was a human gesture, she knew. Among her people they would have touched foreheads. But this was a joining of two cultures, so she supposed both traditions would have to bend. She placed her scaled hand in his larger one, and the contact sent a shock through her system. His skin was so warm. Corthans were cold-blooded, their body temperature matching their environment. But humans generated their own heat, and Jake's hand felt almost hot against her cooler palm. The sensation was alien and uncomfortable. She resisted the urge to pull away. "I know this is not what either of us wanted," Jake said quietly, speaking only to her while the council representative continued the formal declarations. "But I give you my word that I will do everything I can to make this work. You will be treated with respect and kindness. That is my promise to you." Vela wanted to believe him, but she had learned long ago that words were easy to speak and promises were easy to break. What mattered were actions, and she would not know the truth of his character until they were alone, away from witnesses and political oversight. That was when the mask would fall. That was when she would see what kind of creature she had truly been bound to. The ceremony concluded with the formal pronouncement. In the eyes of the Galactic Council, in the records of both the Korthan Empire and the Terran Federation, they were now married. Bound together by law and treaty, Vela felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like heavy chains. Jake offered his arm to escort her from the hall. It was another human custom. Vela hesitated, every instinct in her body screaming at her to keep distance from this predator. But dozens of eyes were watching, and this moment would be recorded and broadcast across multiple worlds. She could not show weakness or reluctance, not here, not now. She placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, barely touching the fabric. Together they walked down from the platform and through the hall, past the rows of dignitaries and officials from a dozen different species. Camera drones floated around them, capturing every angle of the newly married couple. Vela kept her face calm and neutral, the way she had been trained since childhood. Never let them see your true feelings. Never show fear or doubt in public. The corridors of Concordia Prime Station stretched before them, and Jake led the way to the residential section that had been prepared for their use. These would be their quarters for the next month while the final treaty details were negotiated. After that, they would move to a joint diplomatic vessel where they would live and work together, representing the alliance between their peoples. As they walked, Jake matched his pace to hers, never pulling ahead or forcing her to hurry. He nodded politely to the various beings they passed in the corridors, and Vela noticed how many of them seemed surprised by his courtesy. Apparently, humans had a reputation even among other species. When they finally reached the door to their assigned quarters, Jake placed his palm on the security panel, and the door slid open. He gestured for her to enter first, another gesture of human politeness. Vela stepped inside and looked around at what would be her home for the coming weeks. The space was divided into several rooms. A main living area with seating and a viewing screen, a small kitchen area, though most of their meals would likely be taken in the station's dining facilities, and 2 bedrooms, she noted with relief. Separate sleeping quarters, at least she would have some privacy. "I had them adjust the environmental controls in the bedroom on the right," Jake said, breaking the silence. "The temperature and humidity should match Korthan preferences. I hope it is comfortable for you." Vela turned to look at him, surprised. "You did not have to do that. I wanted you to feel at home," Jake replied simply, "or as close to it as possible in this situation." She studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives, but his expression seemed genuine. Perhaps he was simply a good actor. Time would tell. "Thank you," she said carefully. Jake nodded and moved toward the other bedroom. "I will leave you to settle in. If you need anything, just let me know. We have a dinner with the council representatives tonight, but until then, your time is your own." He disappeared into his room, and Vela was left standing alone in the main living area. She released a breath she had not realized she was holding. The first encounter was over and nothing terrible had happened. But this was only the beginning. Vela went to her assigned bedroom and found that Jake had been truthful. The temperature was perfect, matching the cooler climate she was used to. The furniture was a mix of Korthan and neutral styles, an attempt to make the space welcoming. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. She was married to a human. This strange, warm-blooded warrior was now her husband in the eyes of the law. She would live with him, work with him, represent an alliance alongside him, and she had no idea if she could trust him. The fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest. But underneath it something else stirred. Curiosity, perhaps. Jake Morrison had been polite and considerate so far. He had made efforts to accommodate her needs. But Vela knew that anyone could be kind when others were watching. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when they were alone and the political theater fell away. She would watch him carefully. She would stay alert and keep her guard up. And maybe if she was lucky. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding ceremony, and Vela had settled into a careful routine. She woke early before Jake was up and took her morning meal alone in her room, She spent her days in the study area, working on diplomatic reports and learning more about human culture through the station's database. When Jake returned from his duties in the evening, she would join him for dinner because it was required, but she kept the conversations short and formal. After the meal, she would retreat to her room again, claiming tiredness or work that needed finishing. Jake never complained about her distance. He never pushed her to spend more time with him or demanded that she act like a real wife. He simply went about his daily routine, greeting her politely when they crossed paths, asking if she needed anything, and then leaving her alone when she said she was fine. It should have made things easier, but somehow his patience only made Vela more confused. She had expected anger. She had expected demands and shows of dominance. That was what the propaganda had taught her about humans. They were supposed to be emotional and aggressive, taking what they wanted without regard for others. But Jake did none of those things. He was calm and respectful, giving her space even though the entire galaxy expected them to be building a relationship. The diplomatic vessel Horizon had become their new home after the month at Concordia Prime. It was a ship designed specifically for their mission, with crew members from both Corthan and human backgrounds. Vela had her own office where she worked with Corthan officials on trade agreements and cultural exchange programs. Jake had his command duties, overseeing the security protocols and coordinating with both human and Corthan military forces. One morning, Vela entered the dining area to find Jake already there, sitting at the table with a data pad and a cup of the dark liquid humans called coffee. She paused in the doorway, considering whether to turn back and eat in her room instead. Jake looked up and saw her. "Good morning, Vela, please come in." "I was just finishing up some reports." She moved forward slowly, going to the food dispenser to request her usual breakfast. When she turned back with her tray, she found that Jake had cleared his things from the table, making space for her. "You did not have to move," Vela said, sitting down across from him. "I know," Jake replied, "but I thought you might prefer more room." They ate in silence for a few minutes. Vela picked at her food, aware of his presence even though he was not looking at her. Finally, curiosity got the better of her caution. "Why do you drink that?" she asked, nodding toward his coffee cup. "I have read that it contains a stimulant. Does your body require it to function properly?" Jake smiled slightly. "No, humans can function fine without coffee. It is more of a habit, I suppose. And I like the taste. My mother used to make it every morning when I was growing up. I guess it reminds me of home." "Your mother," Vela repeated. "Do you miss your family?" "Every day," Jake admitted. "But they understood why I took this assignment. They believed in the alliance, in building peace instead of continuing the conflicts." Vela studied him carefully. His expression held sadness but also something else. Pride, perhaps, or determination. "They must be very proud of you." "I hope so," Jake said quietly. Then he changed the subject. "I noticed in the reports that you have been working on the education exchange program. How is that progressing?" They talked about work for a while, and Vela found herself relaxing slightly. This was safe territory. Discussing policies and programs did not require personal revelations or emotional vulnerability. When breakfast ended, they went their separate ways, but something small had shifted. The conversation had been almost pleasant. Over the next few days, Vela began to notice things about Jake that did not match her expectations. She observed how he interacted with the crew during their shared meals in the common dining hall. With the human crew members, he was friendly but professional, making jokes but also setting clear boundaries about appropriate behavior. With the Corthan crew members, he was careful and respectful, always asking about proper protocols before making requests. One afternoon, she witnessed him resolving a dispute between a human engineer and a Corthan technician who disagreed about the best way to repair a malfunctioning environmental system. Jake listened to both sides carefully, asked questions to understand the technical details, and then suggested a compromise that incorporated ideas from both approaches. Neither crew member left the conversation feeling defeated or dismissed. Vela also noticed the small things he did without announcing them. The temperature in the common areas was adjusted to be slightly cooler than human preference, more comfortable for the Corthan crew. The food dispensers had been reprogrammed to offer a wider variety of Corthan dishes. When there were cultural celebrations for either species, Jake made sure the ship acknowledged them appropriately. And there were personal touches too. One day Vela mentioned in passing that she missed a particular Corthan fruit, that did not grow well in controlled environments. She thought nothing of the comment, but 2 weeks later she found a container of the fruit in the kitchen area with a note that simply said it had arrived in the latest supply shipment. When she asked Jake about it, he admitted he had contacted several suppliers to find someone who could provide it. "Why would you go to such trouble?" Vela asked, genuinely puzzled. Jake shrugged. "It seemed important to you, and it was not that much trouble, really. Just a few messages." But Vela knew it had been more than that. Getting rare food items shipped across space was expensive and required navigating complex logistics. He had done it simply because she missed something from home. The moment that truly began to change things came during the 3rd week aboard the Horizon. Vela was working late in her office, reviewing a particularly complex trade proposal. She had lost track of time, and when she finally looked up from her screen, she realized it was well past midnight according to the ship's cycle. She stood and stretched, her muscles stiff from sitting too long. As she moved toward the door, the entire ship suddenly shuddered violently. The lights flickered and an alarm began blaring through the corridors. Vela's training kicked in immediately. She recognized the pattern of the alarm. It was a combat alert. Before she could reach the door panel, it slid open and Jake rushed in. He was not in his formal uniform but in combat gear, clearly having come straight from the command deck. His face was tense but controlled. "We need to get you to the safe room now," he said without preamble. "We have multiple unidentified vessels approaching. They dropped out of warp without proper clearance or communication. We think they are pirates." Vela felt her blood run cold. Pirate attacks on diplomatic vessels were rare but not unheard of. The ships carried valuable supplies and equipment, and kidnapping important passengers could be extremely profitable. Jake held out his hand. "Please, Vela, we need to move quickly." She took his hand without thinking and he led her out into the corridor. Crew members were rushing in all directions, moving to their emergency stations. The ship shuddered again and Jake's grip on her hand tightened, steadying her. They moved through the corridors at a rapid pace, Jake navigating the chaos with practiced ease. When they passed a junction where several crew members had gathered in confusion, Jake stopped long enough to give clear directions, sending them to their proper stations before continuing on with Vela. She noticed that his body was always positioned between her and any potential threat. When they turned corners, he looked first before allowing her to follow. When they passed through doorways, he checked each room before letting her enter. He was protecting her, she realized, not because it was his duty or because someone was watching, but because he genuinely wanted to keep her safe. They reached the reinforced safe room near the center of the ship. Several other non-combat personnel were already there, including some of the civilian staff and a few junior crew members. Jake guided Vela inside and immediately went to the control panel, checking the security systems and communication links. Another crew member, a human lieutenant named Kate Phillips, was coordinating the civilians. She was helping people into the safety harnesses mounted on the walls, designed to protect them if the ship took damage. Jake came over to Vela, holding one of the harnesses. "I need to get you secured," he said. "The room is reinforced, but if we take direct hits, there could be serious shaking." Vela allowed him to help her into the harness, his hands quick and efficient but never rough. When he pulled the straps tight across her chest and waist, she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. "You are afraid?" she said, looking up at him in surprise. Jake met her eyes directly. "Yes, I am, but you are a soldier, a commander. Do humans not train themselves to be fearless in combat?" "Fearlessness is not the same as courage," Jake said quietly. "Fear is natural. It keeps you alert and careful. It helps you survive. Anyone who claims they feel no fear in a situation like this is either lying or dangerously overconfident." Vela stared at him. In all her life, she had never heard a warrior admit to fear so openly and without shame. Among her people, military leaders were expected to project absolute confidence at all times. Showing fear was considered a weakness that would undermine authority and morale. The days following the pirate attack brought unexpected changes to the relationship between Vela and Jake. The walls she had carefully built around herself began to develop small cracks. And through those cracks, curiosity started to seep in. She found herself watching him more often, not with suspicion or fear, but with genuine interest in understanding who he really was beneath the uniform and the reputation. She noticed patterns in his behavior that she had missed before. Every morning, Jake spent 30 minutes in the ship's small gym, going through a routine of exercises that kept his body strong and ready. But unlike the aggressive combat training she had seen in military footage, his movements were controlled and almost meditative. When she asked him about it once, he explained that physical training helped him think clearly and manage stress. It was not about violence, he said, but about discipline and taking care of himself so he could take care of others. Vela also observed how Jake interacted with the various crew members during daily operations. There was a young Corthan communications officer named Theron, who often made mistakes due to nervousness. Instead of punishing him harshly or replacing him, Jake took time to work with Theron personally, helping him develop better systems and building his confidence. Within 2 weeks, Theron's error rate had dropped significantly, and the young officer looked at Jake with something close to admiration. When a human security specialist named Lisa Grant got into a heated argument with a Corthan engineer over resource allocation, Jake called them both to his office. Vela happened to be passing by when they emerged an hour later, and she saw that both crew members looked thoughtful rather than angry. Later, she learned that Jake had helped them see the situation from each other's perspectives and develop a compromise that satisfied both departments. These small observations accumulated like drops of water slowly filling a container. Each one challenged the image of humans that Vela had carried for so long. But the real change came during a quiet evening 2 weeks after the attack. Vela had finished her work earlier than usual and found herself restless. Instead of retreating to her room as she normally would, she wandered through the ship's corridors, eventually ending up in one of the observation lounges. These small rooms had large windows that looked out into space, providing a peaceful place to think. When she entered, she was surprised to find Jake already there. He stood by the window, his back to the door, staring out at the stars. In his hand, he held a small rectangular object. Vela hesitated, considering whether she should leave and give him privacy. But before she could decide, Jake turned and saw her. "Vela," he said, and there was something different in his voice, a heaviness she had not heard before. "I did not expect anyone else to be here. I can leave if you wish to be alone," she offered. "No," Jake said quickly. "Please stay. I could use the company, actually." Vela moved into the room and approached the window. Up close, she could see that the object in Jake's hand was a small frame containing a photograph. 2 humans looked out from the image, both smiling. One was a woman with gentle eyes and graying hair. The other was a man with a strong jaw and laugh lines around his mouth. "Your family?" Vela asked softly. Jake nodded. "My parents. My mother, Claire, and my father, Peter." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "My mother died 2 years ago. Cancer. It is a disease that humans get sometimes. She fought it for 3 years, but in the end, her body could not win that battle." "I am sorry," Vela said, and she meant it. She knew the pain of loss. Her own grandmother had died when she was young, and the grief had been overwhelming. "My father died when I was 19. Jake continued. "He was a pilot in the Terran Defense Fleet like me. There was a training accident. An engine malfunction that happened too fast for anyone to react. He died doing what he loved, but that does not make it hurt any less." Vela looked at the photograph more carefully. "They look kind." "They were," Jake said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "My mother believed that everyone deserved compassion, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. She used to say that building bridges was always better than building walls. My father taught me that real strength was not about how hard you could hit, but about how much you could endure and still choose to be good." He fell silent, and Vela could see him struggling with feelings that were clearly still raw. Despite the time that had passed, she had been taught that showing such emotion was inappropriate, especially for someone in a leadership position. But there was something honest about Jake's grief, something real that made her want to comfort him rather than judge him. "Do you think about what they would say?" Vela asked. "About all of this? The alliance, the marriage, everything that has happened?" Jake smiled sadly. "All the time. I think my mother would have been thrilled. She always believed that different species could find common ground if they just took the time to understand each other. My father would have been more cautious, but he would have supported the decision. He believed in duty and service above personal desires." "This marriage was not your choice," Vela said, finally voicing something that had been on her mind for weeks. "You had no more say in it than I did. Does that not make you angry?" "Sometimes," Jake admitted. Not at you, but at the situation. At the fact that our peoples could not find peace without forcing two strangers into a bond they did not ask for. But anger does not change anything. I can be resentful and make both of us miserable, or I can try to make the best of what we have been given. I chose the second option. Vela felt something shift inside her chest. Why are you kind to me? She asked suddenly. You could treat me with coldness and still fulfill your obligations to the treaty. You could ignore me except when appearances require otherwise. But you go out of your way to make things comfortable for me. Why? Jake looked at her directly, his brown eyes serious. Because you deserve kindness. Because being forced into this situation does not mean we have to be enemies or strangers. And because I genuinely want you to be happy, Vela. Or as happy as possible given the circumstances. But I have been so distant, Vela said. I have kept you at arm's length, barely spoken to you beyond what was necessary. I have given you no reason to be kind. You do not need to earn kindness, Jake replied firmly. That is not how it works. Or at least that is not how it should work. You were afraid of me. You had every right to be, given what you had been taught about humans. I could not expect you to trust me immediately just because some council declared us married. Trust has to be built over time through actions, not words. Vela stared at him, feeling the last of her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. I was taught that humans were violent and unpredictable, that you acted on emotion without thought or control, that you could not be trusted because you might turn dangerous at any moment. I know, Jake said quietly. We were taught similar things about Corthans, that you were cold and calculating, that you saw other beings as tools to be used, that you had no real emotions, only programmed responses. Propaganda works by making the other side seem less than fully alive, less deserving of empathy. But you did not believe it. I tried not to, Jake said. My mother's teaching stuck with me. She always said to look at individuals, not stereotypes, to give people a chance to show you who they really are before making judgments. He paused. You have shown me kindness in your own way, Vela. You have been polite and respectful even when you were afraid. You have worked hard on the alliance programs. You have treated the Corthan crew members with fairness. Those are not the actions of someone who is cold or uncaring. Vela felt warmth spreading through her chest, a sensation that had nothing to do with temperature. For weeks she had been analyzing Jake, trying to understand him, but he had been doing the same thing, looking past her fear to see the person underneath. Tell me about them, she said softly, gesturing to the photograph. Your parents. I want to know who they were. Jake's face brightened slightly and he moved to sit on one of the benches near the window. Vela sat beside him, closer than she had ever allowed herself to be before. And for the next 2 hours Jake talked. He told her about growing up on Earth in a place called Colorado where mountains touched the sky. He described his mother's garden where she grew vegetables and flowers, spending hours with her hands in the soil. She had taught him that nurturing living things required patience and care, that you could not force growth but only provide the right conditions and wait. He talked about his father's terrible sense of humor, how he would make awful jokes that made everyone groan but also laugh. Peter Morrison had been strict about discipline and training, but he had also been warm and affectionate, never too proud to tell his son he loved him. Jake shared memories of family dinners and holiday celebrations, of learning to pilot small aircraft with his father, and learning to cook with his mother. He talked about the day he decided to join the defense fleet, how scared his mother had been but how she had supported his choice anyway because she believed in letting people follow their own paths. And slowly, carefully, Vela began to share her own stories. She told Jake about her childhood in the royal palace, about the pressure of being a princess and the expectations that came with her position. The weeks following that night in the observation lounge brought changes that Vela could not have imagined when this journey began. She and Jake fell into a new pattern of spending time together, not because duty required it, but because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. They shared meals and talked about everything from politics to personal dreams. They watched entertainment programs from both their cultures, laughing at the differences and finding surprising similarities. Slowly, carefully, what had begun as a forced arrangement was becoming something real. Vela found herself thinking about Jake at odd moments during the day. When she read something interesting in a report, her first instinct was to share it with him. When something amusing happened with the crew, she looked forward to telling him about it later. And when she went to sleep at night, Her last thoughts were often about their conversations and the way his face lit up when he smiled. She was not ready to name these feelings yet. But they were there, growing stronger each day. The moment that changed everything came during a diplomatic mission to a colony world called Haven's Rest. The planet sat in disputed territory between human and Korthan space, and both species had established settlements there decades ago. Tensions between the two communities had been building for months, with both sides claiming historical rights to valuable mining areas and water sources. The Galactic Council had sent Vela and Jake to mediate the dispute, hoping that their presence as symbols of the new alliance would encourage cooperation. The negotiations started badly and only got worse. The human settlement leader, a stern woman named Patricia Clark, insisted that her people had been there first and had the surveys to prove it. The Korthan settlement leader, an older male named Korath, countered that his people had formal documentation from the old empire granting them rights to the land. Neither side would budge, and after 3 days of talks, they were no closer to agreement than when they started. On the 4th day, Jake suggested they tour both settlements to better understand the situation. Vela agreed, and they spent the morning visiting the human community. The settlers showed them farms and water processing facilities, schools where children learned, and medical centers that served the population. These were not just abstract political positions, Vela realized. These were people's lives and futures being debated. In the afternoon, they visited the Korthan settlement. The tour was similar, showing them the infrastructure and communities that had been built over years of hard work. By the time evening came, both Vela and Jake were exhausted but more committed than ever to finding a solution. They were walking back to the shuttle that would take them to the government building where they were staying when everything went wrong. The sound came first, a sharp crack that echoed off the buildings. Jake's body moved before Vela's mind could process what was happening. He threw himself at her, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her down behind a stone planter as another crack sounded. Something hot whizzed past where Vela's head had been a moment before. "Stay down," Jake ordered, his body covering hers protectively. His voice was calm but urgent. More shots rang out and Vela heard shouting from multiple directions. Security forces from both communities were responding, trying to locate the shooter. Jake kept himself between Vela and the direction the shots had come from, using his own body as a shield. "Are you hit?" he asked, his hands quickly checking her for injuries. "Vela, are you hurt?" "No," she managed to say, though her hearts were pounding so hard she could barely hear her own voice. "I am not hurt. Good, stay close to me. We need to move to better cover." Jake guided them behind a larger structure, a storage building that provided more protection. Security forces were closing in on the shooter's location, and within minutes the sound of weapons fire stopped. A human officer approached them cautiously. "Commander Morrison, Princess Vela, we have the shooter in custody." It was a Korthan radical, someone who opposes the alliance. "He was targeting both of you, but it looks like his main focus was the princess." Vela felt cold despite the warm afternoon air. Someone had tried to kill her. Someone from her own species. Someone who hated the idea of peace so much that they were willing to commit murder. "Is anyone else hurt?" Jake asked, still keeping himself positioned protectively near Vela. "2 security personnel took minor injuries, but nothing serious. You both need to come with us to the secured facility immediately." They were rushed to an armored vehicle and transported to the government complex where medical teams were waiting. Vela submitted to the examination in a daze, barely registering the doctor's questions and tests. Her mind kept replaying those moments, the sound of the shots, the feeling of Jake's body covering hers, the realization of how close she had come to death. When the doctors finally cleared her, she was taken to a private room where she could rest, but rest was impossible. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking, trying to process what had happened. The door opened and Jake entered. He had changed out of his damaged clothing and wore a simple shirt and pants. His face was serious as he approached her. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. "I do not know," Vela admitted. "I keep thinking about what could have happened. If you had not moved so quickly, if you had not been there." "But I was there," Jake said firmly. "And you are safe." "That is what matters." Vela looked up at him, really looked at him. His shirt sleeve had been torn during the incident, and she could see a bandage on his upper arm. "You are injured," she said, standing up quickly. "The shot hit you. It is just a graze, Jake said, trying to wave it off. Nothing serious. The medical team already treated it. You took a shot meant for me, Vela said, her voice rising. You put yourself in danger. You could have been killed? Yes, Jake said simply. I could have been. But I was not going to let anything happen to you if I could prevent it. Why? Vela demanded, and she could feel emotion overwhelming her careful control. Why would you risk your life like that? We are bound by treaty, but that does not mean you have to die for me. This is not your fight. Jake stepped closer, his expression intense. Vela, listen to me. I did not protect you today because of the treaty or because of duty or because someone told me to. I protected you because the thought of losing you terrifies me more than any weapon ever could. Vela stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. What are you saying? I am saying that somewhere along the way this stopped being about politics for me, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. You matter to me, Vela, not as a princess or as a symbol of the alliance, but as a person, as someone I care about deeply, as someone He paused, then continued, as someone I have fallen in love with. The words hung in the air between them, and Vela felt her entire world shift. Love. He loved her. This human warrior who had been forced to marry a stranger, who had every reason to resent the situation, had somehow fallen in love with her, and the most shocking realization was that she felt the same way. I was so afraid of you when this started, Vela said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought you would be cruel or violent or controlling. I thought humans were monsters. But you showed me kindness when you had no obligation to. You gave me space when I needed it and companionship when I was ready. You made me laugh and listened when I needed to talk. You treated me like a person, not like a political tool. She stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them. Today, when you covered me with your own body, when you were willing to take that shot yourself, I realized something. I realized that I trust you completely. I realized that I feel safe with you in a way I have never felt safe with anyone. And I realized that I love you too, Jake Morrison. Jake's expression transformed, hope and joy replacing the worry that had been there moments before. You do? Yes, Vela said, and she reached up to touch his face gently. His skin was warm under her scaled fingers. I love you, not because I have to, not because of duty or treaty, but because of who you are. Because you are kind and brave and honest. Because you see me, really see me, and still choose to be with me. Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Vela pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, letting the reality of their feelings sink in. What happens now? Vela asked finally. Jake pulled back slightly so he could see her face. Now we stop pretending this is just a political arrangement. Now we build something real together. A real marriage, a real partnership, a real life. But the negotiations, Vela said. The attack. Everything is so complicated. It is, Jake agreed. But we will face it together. That is what partners do. We support each other, protect each other, and work through problems as a team. Vela nodded. Together. They spent the rest of the evening talking, this time not as strangers bound by duty, but as two people who had chosen each other. They talked about their fears and hopes, about what kind of life they wanted to build together. They discussed the challenges they would face as an interspecies couple, the scrutiny they would be under, the expectations from both their peoples. But they also talked about the possibilities, about being a real example of what the alliance could mean, about showing both humans and Korthans that 6 months had passed since that day on Haven's Rest when everything changed. 6 months since Vela and Jake had stopped pretending their marriage was just a political arrangement and admitted the truth to themselves and each other. The time had transformed them both in ways neither could have predicted when they first stood together in that ceremonial hall, strangers bound by duty and fear. Now they stood on the observation deck of Unity Station, a massive new facility that orbited in the space between Earth and the Korthan homeworld. The station had been Jake's idea, a neutral place where both species could come together for cultural exchange, scientific collaboration, and diplomatic meetings. Vela had helped design the programs that would bring students and teachers from both worlds, creating opportunities for the next generation to grow up without the prejudices that had divided their parents. The station gleamed in the light of nearby stars, its structure incorporating both human and Korthan architectural styles. It was beautiful and functional, a symbol of what cooperation could achieve. But more than that, it was home. Their home. The place where Vela and Jake had chosen to build their life together. I still cannot believe we actually got this built, Vela said, watching as a transport ship docked at one of the station's ports. There were so many people who said it was impossible, that the costs were too high, that neither species would actually use it. Jake smiled and put his arm around her shoulders, a gesture that now felt as natural as breathing. They underestimated how stubborn we can be when we work together. Besides, we had good help, that was true. Over the past months, Vela and Jake had become more than just symbols of the alliance. They had become active advocates for integration and cooperation. They had traveled to dozens of worlds, speaking at universities and government assemblies, meeting with community leaders and ordinary citizens. They had shared their story honestly, not hiding the difficulties they had faced, but emphasizing what they had learned about choosing connection over division. And slowly, things had begun to change. Other arranged marriages between species were being handled differently now, with more consideration for the individuals involved and more support for helping them build real relationships. Trade agreements were expanding, joint research projects were being funded, and cultural exchange programs were bringing humans and Korthans together in ways that had seemed impossible a year ago. But the changes Vela valued most were the personal ones. She and Jake had learned each other's languages fluently, switching between them easily in conversation. They had shared holidays and traditions from both cultures, creating new customs that blended their backgrounds. They had introduced each other to their families, navigating the awkwardness and eventual acceptance that came with such different backgrounds coming together. Vela's mother, the Empress, had been skeptical at first. She had questioned whether Vela's feelings were real or simply a coping mechanism for an unwanted situation. But after spending time with Jake, seeing how he treated her daughter with respect and genuine affection, the Empress had softened. She still worried about the challenges an interspecies marriage would face, but she no longer doubted that Vela and Jake truly loved each other. Jake's father had been gone for years, but his mother Claire had lived long enough to know about the arranged marriage before she died. Jake often wondered what she would think now, seeing how things had developed. Vela believed Claire would have been proud of her son, proud of the bridge he had helped build between worlds. I have been thinking about something, Jake said, breaking into Vela's thoughts. About our future. About what comes next. Vela turned to look at him, curious. What have you been thinking? I want this to be more than just a political partnership, Jake said carefully. I mean, it already is more than that for us. But I want to make it official in every way. I want us to have a real wedding ceremony. Not the formal treaty signing we had before. Something that celebrates us as individuals. As two people who chose each other. Vela felt warmth spread through her chest. They had talked about this before. About how their first ceremony had been cold and impersonal. Focused entirely on political necessity rather than personal connection. I would like that very much. A ceremony that is actually about us and our commitment to each other. And, Jake continued, his voice slightly nervous now, I have been thinking about family, about children. I know it is complicated with our different species and the medical challenges and everything else, but I want to build a future with you, Vela. A real family, if that is something you want too. Vela's secondary heart skipped a beat. They had discussed this topic briefly, but always in abstract terms. Something for the distant future. Hearing Jake talk about it now with such obvious hope and sincerity made it feel real and immediate. The doctors say it is possible, Vela said slowly. With genetic modification and careful medical supervision, we could have children who carry traits from both our species. They would be something new, something the galaxy has never seen before. They would be ours, Jake said simply. That is what matters to me. Not the politics or the symbolism or what it means for the alliance, just that they would be ours, created from our love for each other. Vela moved closer to him, taking both his hands in hers. Yes, she said firmly. I want that too. I want to build a family with you, to raise children who grow up knowing both cultures, who never have to choose between being human or Korthan because they are both. Jake's face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other and imagining the future they would create together. A soft chime interrupted them, indicating an incoming message. Jake reluctantly released Vela and checked the communication panel. His expression shifted to one of pleasant surprise. "It is from Commander Angela Price on Earth," he said. "She says the Earth government has approved funding for the next phase of the cultural exchange program. They want to send 200 students to Unity Station next semester. And I received confirmation yesterday that the Corthan Council is sending 150 students," Vela added. "That means we will have over 300 young people from both species living and learning together here. Can you imagine what that will mean for the next generation? They will grow up as friends instead of enemies," Jake said. "They will learn each other's languages and customs naturally, without all the baggage and prejudice that our generations carried. They will build relationships and maybe some of them will fall in love just like we did." Vela smiled at the thought. "We are creating something bigger than just ourselves. Every couple that follows our example, every friendship that forms between species, every collaboration that succeeds, it all builds on what we started. What we were forced to start," Jake corrected gently. "But what we chose to continue and make real, that was the heart of it," Vela realized. The beginning had been forced, dictated by political necessity and treaty requirements. But everything that came after, everything that mattered, had been their choice. They had chosen to be kind to each other. They had chosen to look past their fears and prejudices. They had chosen to be vulnerable and honest. They had chosen love. Over the next few weeks, preparations began for their new wedding ceremony. This time it would be held on Unity Station, with guests from both human and Corthan worlds. This time, they would write their own vows, speaking from their hearts rather than reciting formal legal phrases. This time it would be a celebration of their choice to be together, not an obligation they were fulfilling. The planning brought both their cultures together in new ways. They decided to incorporate traditions from both species, creating a ceremony that honored where they came from while looking forward to where they were going. Human music would blend with Corthan instruments. Traditional foods from both worlds would be served. The decorations would mix the colors and symbols that held meaning for each culture. On the day of the ceremony, Vela stood in a private room preparing herself. She wore a dress that combined elements of both Corthan and human wedding attire, the design custom-made to accommodate her physiology, while incorporating the flowing elegance of human formal wear. Her scales had been polished until they gleamed, and she wore jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, the woman who had always encouraged her to follow her heart. There was a knock at the door, and her sister Kira entered. Kira had been skeptical about the arranged marriage at first, worried that Vela would be hurt or mistreated. But after meeting Jake and seeing how he treated her sister, Kira had become one of their strongest supporters. "You look beautiful," Kira said, adjusting a detail on Vela's dress. "Are you nervous?" "No," Vela said, and she realized it was true. "I am excited, happy. This feels right in a way that the first ceremony never did." "Because this time you are choosing it," Kira said wisely. "This time it is real." In another room, Jake was going through his own preparations. He wore a formal uniform that had been modified to include Corthan design elements, a visual representation of how his life had been changed by this marriage. His best friend and fellow officer, Lieutenant Chris Harper, helped him with the final details. "Never thought I would see you this happy," Chris said with a grin.